Greetings. I have put this story together at the request of my family and many of my professional colleagues, and also others interested in not only some background as far as my life is concerned, but also regarding the origins of the Caprini score. I was born in a modest neighborhood of Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia, to two wonderful parents who had endured a lot in their life. They had been married just before 1920 and had a wonderful daughter, Patricia, who at age 11 died on the operating table as a result of an air embolus during a mastoid operation. Needless to say, my parents were devastated by this event, and it was reflected in several ways going forward. My father had a job as superintendent of the liquor stores for the state of Pennsylvania, representing the Philadelphia district. But after my sister died, he lost this job and spent the rest of his life in relatively low-paying jobs. My mother was not only affected by the death of her daughter, but also by the death of her father that occurred many years earlier when she was 6 years old. Her father was going to buy fireworks on the 4th of July, and the trestle he was traveling over on a streetcar collapsed, and he died. My mother also had to deal with the death of her sister Margaret, which she deemed so dearly, and also was very, very close to. Needless to say, my parents were thrilled with being able to have another child, which is reflected in this picture during my early years. I firmly believe that out of tragedy may come good things, and hopefully I will have made positive contributions during that life to reflect that sentiment. During the early years, I was fortunate enough to spend summers on my cousin's farm in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where I learned many things about the farm, including the animals, and also participated in how to collect hay, pick produce from the fields, and a lot of other tasks. And this was really very interesting for me and important as I went forward in my life. I also was a guard on the football team at grade school and a catcher on the Little League baseball team. And here's the original mitt that was used in that 8th grade baseball game where we won the regional championship. A good friend of mine, Donald Jones, was a classmate, and he and I worked together learning how to build a Heath kit, a Dyna kit, other hi-fi components, and also ham radio equipment. And he became instrumental in my introduction to classical music. Using the output of our labors, we played this, which was our first ever recording of classical music that we played, and it was about the Wagner 4-opera masterpiece called The Ring of the Nibelungen. I was able to enjoy that work and those works for the rest of my life in many, many ways going forward. Also, during those early years in grade school, I was active in the Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, and later Explorer Scouts, achieving the rank of Eagle Scout and Order of the Arrow. In the right-hand corner of the picture, you see some merit badges that I had accumulated by the 5th grade. And it's a funny story because during Boy Scout week, we come to school with our merit badges and so forth on. And when the nun saw me, she said, "Well, Caprini, besides you, who won the war?" It was sort of struck me as an odd comment, but maybe in some way she was trying to stimulate me to continue to move forward and do some great things. In addition to that, during my grade school career, I learned how to develop and print pictures due to a close family friend that helped me get started with that. And I had a little photographic business that I actually started that we developed pictures at weddings, sweet 16s, and bar mitzvahs. And that was to go on through my high school years. And this is interesting because it was also instrumental in my trip to England, because I was able to finance that trip by selling my photographic business. After getting involved in the Explorer Scouts, I moved on to the Civil Air Patrol. And this was a very fascinating thing for me because I was always interested in airplanes. And as a part of this Civil Air Patrol, we were able to fly this little Piper Cub. I have about 180 hours in it, never soloed in it, but did a lot of flying in it. And we were always very fascinated with one of the people at this little field where we flew out of that had this very sophisticated, for the time, Beechcraft Bonanza, which was a very high-powered airplane and very luxurious compared to our little Piper Cub. Always wanted to fly in it, and then came down to fly in it one weekend, and the owner said, "I'm sorry, I'm busy with some colleagues this weekend. I'll take you up another time." So I said that was fine. And it turns out that he got in that airplane, took off, it stalled at the end of the runway, went into the trees and blew up, burning up and killing all of them. So that was a really close call that really got my attention. And I feel looking back is very important. Why wasn't I on that airplane? We'll never know. Also, during that time, as a result of the Civil Air Patrol, I was able to participate in a cadet exchange program going across Canada one summer, staying in private homes and Air Force bases. And I learned about the beautiful country and the wonderful people in Canada, and I've always cherished them and our relationships for the rest of my life. The medical school years are very interesting because when I applied to medical school, growing up in a relatively modest neighborhood in a little row house, I couldn't really travel anywhere to school, so I applied to Hahnemann Medical College and Jefferson Medical College, and are both located in Philadelphia. And I was accepted to Hahnemann College first, and so I took that right away. It was an important choice for me because it turns out that there were some really interesting things about Hahnemann Hospital which would help to shape my career going forward. The first of those was meeting this beautiful Stella Evans, the light of my life, guiding light. And here I'm showing a picture of her in the castle of Catherine the Great's palace in St. Petersburg, Russia, which we had the good fortune to visit. And this is a setting fit for a queen, and there she is. She has guided me throughout my whole life and been responsible for helping me in many, many ways with her loving, caring, always thoughtful ways, constructive criticism, never out of nastiness, or just a wonderful human being that I've had the good fortune now to be with for many, many years. Probably about 58, we figured earlier today. And then because of that, I was courting her in medical school because she was at 18 years of age the department chairman, personal administrative assistant. And so I hung around the Department of Medicine and got to meet Dr. Wilbur Oakes. And Dr. Oakes was a defining factor in my life and also thousands of other lives. Here he is with his quote, "I always loved the students and the residents. I don't know what I would have done without the kids to teach." And we would make rounds with him, and it was fascinating how he could draw out a history and physical from a patient in a very short period of time. And you have to realize in those days we had no CAT scans, no MRIs, no troponins, no D-dimers. And all of what we had to do, and sometimes even operate on the patients, was based on the history and physical examination. So that was the first of the 4 major Caprini building blocks. Now, in addition, Hahnemann Hospital also had some other resources in store for me. Dr. John Howard, who was the chairman of surgery, helped me get started in research, and I was able to help two surgeons from University of Liverpool that were spending a year at my hospital, that university, and we were doing research. I was assisting them in operations, doing kidney transplants, as well as a research project on common bile duct strictures. As a result of that association, they would eventually invite me to England for a semester during my medical school, and this is a very, very important issue, because this will be another defining Caprini building block. And during this period of the fall and winter of 1963, I went over to Europe on the old Queen Mary. It was $300 for passage on the Queen Mary one way and on Aer Lingus on the 707 the other way. And I'll never forget making ward rounds with Professor Ian McPhee, chairman of surgery. He would take the students in, and after the sisters would clear the wards and give him the okay, he would go on the wards and he would teach us. He would take a person and stand them up and next to the window, a thin person, and show us how the slips of the diaphragm work during inspiration and expiration. He would show us a caput medusa, which was the venous abnormality that was seen around the umbilicus in patients with liver disease. And he would show us many other things, changes in the fingernails, the skin, and so forth. The second thing that was really fascinating about this experience in Liverpool was visiting these clinics, which were held twice a month. And you went to the clinic in the evening, and they would draw back the curtain, and there would be a patient. So here was a patient, and the patient had a swollen arm, and you would have to interview the patient and ask the patient, well, what do you do? And, well, I'm a paper hanger. And how did this happen? Well, all of a sudden I woke up one day and my arm was swollen. And so what we did was we went through a history and physical and learned about what later would be known, of course, as the Paget-Schrader syndrome, effort thrombosis, where the first rib can impinge on the subclavian vein and produce a thrombosis. It's peculiar to paper hangers, which is what this man's profession was, and also, of course, to baseball pitchers. The third thing that really strikes me about this University of Liverpool experience, and why this represents collectively a building block, was my visit to St. Thomas's. And we were welcomed by Professor John Hobbs, who, along with Davies, had invented the fibrinogen scanning, which was the first scanning modality for the diagnosis of deep vein thrombosis. And he would say, welcome to St. Thomas's. We were open 30 years prior to the Battle of Hastings, which of course was 1066. And he said, today we're going to talk about a special syndrome that's very important for all of you to know, called the Kipple-Trinani syndrome. And this is a syndrome where there are large varicose veins in the leg, but also there is hypertrophy of the bone and soft tissues and a pigmented nevus. And it's very important for all of you to recognize this syndrome, because if you were to inadvertently remove the veins in this person's leg, that might severely compromise them and they may lose their leg, because another feature of the Kipple-Trinani syndrome that can't be seen by looking at the leg is a defect in the deep venous system, where they have an agenesis of the veins, or the veins are very small and they can't carry the blood load alone out of the leg. That's why we need the superficial veins. And of course, his fibrinogen scanning and later venography were very important in identifying these defects. So altogether, this was another seminal event, that all of this emphasis on these 3 months in England were all on physical diagnosis and the history and physical examination and its importance in the overall evaluation of the patients. Now, this is a quote borrowed from one of my favorite songs by Frank Sinatra, called "It Was a Very Good Year." And certainly 1965, especially June, was an extremely good year for me. I graduated from medical school, and here I am shown with my beautiful bride-to-be. And then 1 week later, this marriage to this wonderful lady. And I would say that these events set us up for life. And we're still going strong 55 years later, along with a wonderful family that we have put together through this time because of our relationships. Without her influence, I don't know really that I would have been very successful in what I had done, because she helped me in so many ways. Now let's talk about Evanston Hospital. Evanston Hospital turned out to be a real blessing for me as well. I was invited, I wanted to go to California and go to one of the big universities there, and I had an invitation to do that, but I met a friend who encouraged me, said, go try out Evanston Hospital. And the reason I met this man was that during my medical school years, I was also an extern at Chester Hospital, which was an indigent hospital in Chester, Pennsylvania. We'd do histories and physicals, and we'd go after medical school in junior and senior year and do these histories and physicals. And he said, why don't you go and check out Evanston Hospital, because that's where he had come from. So I went there, and it was a fascinating place. First of all, I knew I wanted to do surgery, so I did a straight medical internship. And as a result of that, I really can't tell you how important it was, and it's another Caprini score building block. On Sundays, we would have 6 or 7 admissions, and we would go to each patient, do the history, do the physical, write up the orders, talk to the doctor, be up to a 2-hour process per patient. And then the next day, we would come in and make rounds with a physician and see those patients. And it was astonishing to me that outstanding clinicians such as Dr. Harry Miller, Dr. Stephen Curtides, would take us into these patient rooms and in 15 minutes extract more information and get a better history and physical than it took us 2 hours to collect. And their awesome skills in being able to pull important details out of the patient just really were fascinating to me. And again, as I say, another important Caprini score building block. Now, after that year of internship, I took a year of general surgical residency. I was really planning to go into neurosurgery and was accepted into the neurosurgical program. And as my experience later demonstrated to me, I was going to go a different direction, but I didn't realize it at the time. Well, I was enrolled in the Berry plan, which meant that you would be allowed to continue medical school, but once you were done, you could be drafted into the service, which I was in 1967, and sent to a Strategic Air Command Air Force Base in Great Falls, Montana, which had a 40-bed hospital associated with it, and the troops drove 1 million miles a month in support of 200 missile sites. And here you see a picture of the missile site. And I was the junior surgeon, so I was directed by my senior, and you see him here, Dr. Earl Sweet, a fabulous surgeon that I had the good fortune to work with for several years and became lifelong friends. And he said, Joe, you're going to do the tonsils. And so I was very afraid that I would operate on a bleeding child, so I had the corpsman do a screening profile on every child that I saw for tonsillectomy. They do a IV bleeding time, a platelet count, a Klaus fibrinogen, and a clotting time. That's all we had in those days. But based on that, about 10% of over 100 kids had abnormalities. And so we never operated on those children. We sent them out by air vac down to Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver. And most of them had mild von Willebrand's disease. But the point is, I was able to go through all of these tonsillectomies through my Air Force career without a single bad bleeder. And the other thing that I didn't realize at the time, but really became important, was that this was the precursor of the pre-admission screening program. Because when I came back to my residency, and as I went through it, that was another thing that I helped establish, was a pre-admission screening precursor. And also, it was a forerunner of the Caprini Special Coagulation Laboratory. More about that in a minute. The residency, when I had gone back to Evanston Hospital, was transitioned to Northwestern University. And so I had to do 6 months of research. And so I partnered with Dr. Stephen Curtides. He helped me set up a small lab and get a small grant to study bleeding patients that were coming into the emergency room that mostly required surgery in those days. And we studied 54 patients, and 18 of those 54 patients we did all the blood tests on them, but also by that time we had some additional blood tests that we could do. PT, PTT, fibrin split products, and also the secret weapon, which was the thromboelastograph. And with all of those tests, we were able to avoid surgery in a third of those 54 patients, and that was a very successful program. As a result of that, from that point on, any patient who came into the hospital bleeding, they would call us, call this Caprini lab. Now, I was back in my residency, and so we had to get somebody to help run the laboratory, but that was possible because of Dr. John Dorsey, who assumed responsibility for this as a special coagulation lab for the Department of Surgery. And over the next 25 years, we studied 100,000 patients in this laboratory and just got a wealth of experience regarding a whole variety of issues. And one of the most important things was the thromboelastographic research. Now, because of this special testing that we had, we were sought out by the Robert R. McCormick School of Engineering, first by Dr. Thomas Goldstick, which I helped do an experiment in gracilis artery oxygen muscle concentrations, because we were looking at oxygen and nitrous oxide. And then subsequently with Professor Lyle Makros, who came up with one of the first designs for the artificial lung. And he was very interested in the blood coagulation changes in that. And so we'll talk more about the thromboelastograph, but that was another feature that occurred and started during my residency. In addition to that was this very fortunate circumstance where I got to meet Professor Rudolfo Mazzarello, who was from Argentina and had a forceps. And I was introduced to him, and together we were able to patent the Mazzarello forceps. And as you can see here, the long forceps with the wide tips, and there is no expansion of the body or the shaft of the forceps. They rotate, whereas a regular forceps, of course, expands. So in this way, that forceps could be placed through a sinus tract and stones, for example, extracted. And when I got out of my residency and through my career, I was able to successfully extract in over 800 patients retained common duct stones after cholecystectomy through the T-tube tracts without having to have the patients reoperated on. So that was a very successful program. All coming from Evanston Hospital. Evanston Hospital was a wonderful milieu, as well as Northwestern University, of being able to have a young person grow and develop. Now let's talk about the TEG, the thromboelastograph. This is a device where blood is placed into a cup and the cup rotates, and then a piston goes into the cup. The top of the surface of the blood is covered with oil, and then as the blood starts to clot, one can track the onset of blood coagulation, the rate of blood coagulation, the clot strength, and the rate of dissolution. And here we show the difference between a native and a sea-light specimen. The native specimen, the blood, the onset of clotting here with this R time is longer, the angle or steepness is less, and the width is less than when you add sea-light to a cup. And what we did was we took the patient's blood and we added sea-light to one cup and then the native blood in the other cup. And in that way constructed a mathematical equation to equate statistical significance for possible hypercoagulability as we were to test further in patients. But the first thing it did, which was really interesting, is that when you draw blood from a vein, the needle goes through the skin and you can get tissue juice in that needle. So when the blood contacts the needle, you can begin a clotting time right in the needle. And at the time when we started our lab, there were reports of high PTTs in patients who were on heparin therapy, 100 seconds, 150 seconds. And What we figured out was, using the TEG, is that when we studied those patients' blood with a contaminated blood draw, the native blood looked exactly like the C-light activated specimen. So in that way, we were able to identify contaminated specimens, and we had a very careful two-syringe technique to avoid that, which became very popular and, of course, is used universally today. But that's not all. Not only were we able to identify contaminated blood specimens, but it turned out that this C-light activated thromboelastography was a pretty good test of hypercoagulability. I wrote a thesis on this about coagulation in cancer, thinking it was a great test for cancer. Well, it did predict hypercoagulability that's common in cancer patients, but it also predicted many other instances where there was hypercoagulability. One of the most unique uses of the thromboelastograph during that era was patients that came in with serious pulmonary emboli and it looked like they were going to die. We would try to give them lytic therapy. Now, there was streptokinase and urokinase that had been proven for this. But urokinase had come under some problems because of some manufacturing difficulties with kidney cells from the monkeys, so that all we had was streptokinase. Now, streptokinase was very cheap, and it was a very good lytic. But you never knew what the dose was, because if you gave it to a patient who'd had a strep infection previously in their life, it took a really high dose. Whereas if the patient never had a strep infection, it took a low dose. So what we did was, when the patients came into the emergency room, we put a series of concentrations of streptokinase in blood cups, 125,000 units, 250, 500, 750, and 1 million. And then we would see which cup was able to lyse the blood in a very short period of time. Usually within 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, we had our answer. So we could predict the dose that we could give to the patients that would lyse their clots, but wouldn't cause them to bleed. And I remember sitting by the patients' bedsides during the infusion and watching the dramatic changes that occurred with that. We had a very successful program, and thank God we never had a patient die of bleeding. Another great use for the thromboelastograph was during liver transplant surgery during the anahepatic phase of liver transplantation. The incoagulable state may be either due to a consumptive coagulopathy or a defect in clotting factors, and the TEG was very important in identifying those, as well as for complex bleeding problems, including disseminated intravascular coagulation. But another very good use of the thromboelastograph was its ability of the tracings to help us predict the surface thrombogenicity of various components that were used in Lyle Makros' artificial lung machine and the early versions of the artificial heart. And so that was a very important contribution, and we spent a number of years working with the Department of Bioengineering in that regard. I had the good fortune to be able to meet Dr. Laszlo Lorand, who discovered factor 13, and he introduced me to Professor Oskar Ratnoff. And Oskar Ratnoff was a famous hematologist who actually, when he was born, was very premature, and his father was told to let him die. But his father was a pediatrician and nursed him along, hot water bottles and so forth. And Oskar Ratnoff was one of the people who first described the clotting cascade. And he also discovered factor 12 in his patient, John Hegeman. But most importantly for this discussion, he showed with 4 experiments that were done before the turn of the 20th century how Hegeman factor, the contact activation factor, activated not only platelets and clotting and fibrinolysis, but also the complement and kallikrein systems of inflammation and immunology. And all of these together he called the tangled web. And so we studied these features in our burn patients and came up with a new term. Instead of referring to what happens in these patients when they bleed as DIC, we've referred to it as disseminated intravascular multiple systems activation. Boy, isn't that a mouthful. DIMSA. And we were expecting maybe to get some Nobel Prize or something because of that. But anyway, that was just a sort of an interesting thing. And what's fascinating about that now is that the tangled hemostatic web is some in substance associated with the pathophysiologic changes for COVID-19. So that's a very fascinating story. Now back to the Caprini building blocks. Here you see a picture of Dr. Maxwell Borrow, and Dr. Borrow was a surgeon affiliated with Seton Hall University, practiced at the Somerville, New Jersey Community Hospital, and he was very interested in thrombosis, and he did some fabulous early work in several studies with over 1,000 patients, where he studied these patients with fibrinogen scans and confirming venography, and was able to show some very important things about the association of thrombosis in surgical patients. As the patient's time of surgery increased, the incidence of thrombosis increased. As the patient's age increased, the incidence of thrombosis increased. And what was really a blockbuster statement was that 66% of the patients in his series who were operated on that had a previous history of thrombosis suffered a recurrent thrombosis postoperatively. That was assuming they didn't get prophylaxis. And that's true, that's held true today. And as you can see, this was another very important building block in the development of the Caprini score. So now let's put all of this together. The Hahnemann University, Dr. Wilbur Oakes, History and Physicals. Liverpool University with Ian McPhee, Professor John Hobbs. Evanston Hospital with Dr. Stephen Curtides and Dr. Harry Miller. And finally, Maxwell Borrow, Seton Hall University. All of these put together sort of came to a head in 1986. Now, going back as far as 1975, I was approached by the Kendall Corporation because they had come up with these sequential compression devices, which were shown to reduce blood clots after surgery. And it was also known that perhaps in addition to moving blood out of the leg, they also stimulated fibrinolysis. And Professor Bach Lee at the Veterans Hospital in upstate New York had shown changes in the euglobulin lysis time, which is a gross measure of fibrinolysis, when these devices were placed on the arms. And as a result of that's where this began, that these devices, even when used in the legs, would systemically improve fibrinolysis. Unfortunately, further experiments were to show that if you did draw blood out of the groin, you would see those changes. But in the general circulation, they became diluted, and that wasn't really a factor. Now, where that comes back to here with the Caprini score is that the Kendall Corporation said, why don't you try this thromboelastograph and your special tests and see if you can show these changes? Well, we were never able to show those, but in the consequence of that, showed very effectively that they were able to prevent deep vein thrombosis. And we published the first study in general surgical patients using sequential compression devices, showing that the incidence of venous thrombosis could be reduced from over 20% to less than 2%. And these were total events using venography. And so as a result of that and publishing that, which incidentally Kendall didn't want us to do at first because that would have hurt their TED business, but nevertheless we published it. In 1986, I was invited to come to the first NIH consensus conference where the issue of thrombosis was discussed, and my part in the proceedings was to talk about pneumatic compression. And so after it was over, I went back to Kendall and told them that you really need to do a multi-center study in this to show the advantages of this product. And they said, well, we can't do that. We don't really have the money for that. But what we thought you ought to do is to put together a series of these risk factors and create create a risk factor assessment. And so 4 nurses and a PhD, along with myself, went ahead and produced this early document. I don't want to use their names because I don't know if they want those names released, but in any event, this was all an incredibly important piece of the puzzle that had been building all of these years and now came to fruition in 1986. Another fabulous development in my life was Professor Juan Ignacio Arcelas, who was a brilliant MD, PhD trained surgeon who was trained in Spain. His father was professor and dean of the medical school, and he was also trained in England. As my wife always put it, Juan Joe was the younger, brighter, humbler version of you. And that is really true to today. He was a fabulous asset, and he's shown here also with Gail Size, who taught us everything we know about duplex scanning, and together they formed a team at Evanston Hospital, and other associates too. But back to the Caprini score. Dr. Juan Arcelas, along with one of our internists, Dr. Sandy Candosia, studied at the Glenbrook Hospital 1,000 patients, 500 medical, 500 surgical. And every morning on Morning Report, they would score everybody that came in the night before. And they showed that there were a significant number of patients, over 50% of the population was at high risk for developing a venous thrombosis. So actually they proved the value of the Caprini score in surgical patients at our hospital in 1991. Nevertheless, in the United States, and this was generally true, there was a lot of skepticism about the Caprini score. And at the same time, overseas, it was being accepted country after country that had national health care, because these countries very quickly could figure out scoring patients. They could avoid giving anticoagulants to everybody, save it for those that needed it the most, and avoid a lot of bleeding complications. So it wasn't until I presented a lecture at the University of Michigan to the Department of Surgery in 2008, actually, and Dr. Thomas Wakefield, Dr. Skip Campbell, Dr. Peter Henke, and a brilliant resident, Dr. Christopher Panucci, all got together and decided to take a look at this score. And in 2010, Vanita Ball, who was a master statistician and epidemiologist, published a study in 8,200 patients showing the value of the Caprini score and showing that there was a non-linear escalation of the score that correlated with the incidence of real venous thromboembolic events. So as the score went up, the incidence of venous thromboembolic events went up. And so finally, it took until then in 2012, finally CHEST, which up to the 2008 version, had been very much against this score because they didn't know enough about it really. Now with this study, and also with a study that was orchestrated through the Plastic Surgery Association, looking at 5 major universities and showing that the Caprini score in those patients that had plastic surgical procedures and had a score of over 8 had an 11% incidence of venous thromboembolic events clinically at 60 days. So this was a really important development. Now I'd like to talk about Louis W. Bigler, who is a great benefactor. He was a patient of mine for many years and left a chair of surgery to the Department of Surgery in my honor that I could use for research. And as a result of that, this enabled us to have a clinical and basic science research laboratory and clinical laboratory for many years. And we had over 300 students and fellows come through that laboratory and work on a variety of projects related to venous thromboembolic disease. With Dr. Stuart Lind in 1992, we established the Coumadin Clinic at the Glenbrook Hospital, which was also very successful. And partnering with Loyola University, we can't forget the enormous contributions in my life by Professors Jawed Fareed, Janine Walenga, and Deborah Hoppenstadt, who I've had a lifelong association with at Loyola, starting in the early 70s when I was able to debate Professor Kakar, who came up with the first use of heparin to prevent blood clots. And he was a guest at the Loyola University, and Loyola got us together. And these individuals have been getting people together and fostering education around the world that has been unparalleled in our time. We also were able to develop an experimental cancer model in harvested arteries from the placenta. After C-sections, we would take the leftover arteries and perfuse them with cancer cells, and shown that we also were able to show that heparin was able to inhibit this cancer cell growth. And this was due to another very wonderful PhD that worked with me by the name of Lakshman Sehgal, who was the developer of one of the artificial bloods. We also were able to work on the vena cava filters because of all of these patients we had encountered over the years, and I was able to devote a considerable period of time to helping with this filter development. In the beginning, we ligated vena cavas and then plicated them into segments with stitches, and then later the DeWeese clip we used, and then later the Moba-Newton umbrella, and finally the laser Greenfield filter. There was also a Hunter balloon, which we also used. So that's where I developed a lot of my vascular surgery interests and clinical activities, but all because we had the time, because I blame Louis Bigler for all of this, giving us the time to do all of this. And we were also involved in studying leg compression, including stockings, bandages, and pneumatic compression, which we will talk more about a little bit later. And I must say that I was able to perform the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy, appendectomy, and herniorrhaphy laparoscopically at Northwestern University. It was done all during the 90s. Part of the reason to be able to do this again comes back to Louis Bigler. I was able to go down to Tennessee and learn from Eddie Joe Reddick the basics of this technique. Now let's talk about the giraffe. As you know, the giraffe is very tall, has long legs, but doesn't develop leg swelling. And by the way, how does all that blood get from the legs back up to the heart? Because the venous pressure in the giraffe at the ankle is 4 times that of a human. The answer is in the skin. The skin is rigid. And because of that rigid skin, as the muscles contract, the blood is forced out of the leg. Now, another incredible development in my life was to meet and work with Dr. Hugo Parsh, who for many years we were together. And Hugo is the world's foremost expert on compression, and especially the principles of short stretch compression that are embodied in the skin of the giraffe. And through that, many presentations and advances were made in the treatment of swelling with the help of Hugo Parsh, who also later, incidentally, there's a bit of irony here, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that is to be talked about after I mentioned Claudia Boyle. Claudia Boyle I met over a quarter of a century ago, and she was a master fitter. And we've learned so much from Claudia over the years. Thousands of patients have been treated successfully by her, fitting with stockings and bandages, and how to tell a good from a bad stocking, and how to treat lymphedema with various compression devices, including flat knit stockings and so forth. And again, working with Hugo and Claudia, we've had a very, very productive relationship over all of those years. Now let's talk about St. Peregrinus. Saint Peregrinus was a monk who lived in the 12th century, and it was the patron saint of cancer and also of leg wounds, of wounds. And one of the reasons for that is that the story is seen here in this beautiful stained glass image window in a church near Vienna, Austria, was the first one. And here we see St. Peregrinus with a big ulcer on his leg. And he took a vow of not lying down, so he developed this ulcer due to varicose veins, and a surgeon was called in to saw off his leg. But it was late in the day. So during the night, an angel of the Lord came and wrapped his leg with a compression dressing, and he was magically healed. Now, is it ironic? Is it an accident? Or is it a divine intervention, as you might say, that Dr. Hugo Parsh, when he received his first Holy Communion, became enamored with this picture and this story, and then later became the foremost compressionist of his time for compression bandages, especially short stretch wraps. Nobody knows, and you can be the judge. Now, because of all of our vascular work, I was able to join the American Venous Forum very early on and able to interact in a very productive way, rising to the presidency in 2010. And this society defined my professional career. And here we see some very famous individuals, and I'd like to point out in the center of that photograph with the blue sport coat on is Professor John Hobbs, who was a dear friend and colleague over the years. Other professors there from Michel Pardin from Paris and J.J. Gex from France, as well as Tony Gasparis and Nikos Lavropoulos, among others, and Fedor Luria is in the foreground. So this society has really been a lifelong family that has definitely been a defining force in my career. Now I'd like to talk about a few of my extracurricular activities. You know, I already had a close brush with death, as I said, from my Beechcraft Bonanza incident, but now here comes another one. I was interested in whitewater rafting and learned how to do whitewater rafting, and rafted there were three class 4 rapids in Montana. Class 4 rapids out of 6 is a very serious rapid. And here we have a place called the Kitchen Sink. And you're seeing a raft going into the beginnings of the kitchen sink. And what they have to do is they have to negotiate this big rock. So as you pull through the kitchen sink, then you have to pull past it so you don't hit the rock. And unfortunately, when I was coming through this, I hit the rock. So instead of cruising nicely by the rock and down through the rest of the rapid, I fell out of the raft, was able to grab the rope that's around the side of the raft, and although I was underwater, I was able to be pulled through the rapid, and I survived. People have died in this rapid. So that was what I would call another close call. Why I escaped, I have no idea. As I said, when I grew up, when I was in grade school, I had a darkroom and learned how to develop pictures. And that was a lifelong pursuit. And here are some pictures from my trip to Alaska for my 70th birthday that my ski buddies and I went on. And here you see a rare photograph of an eagle actually defecating before he lurches forward, defecates, and then jumps out of the bush. And I've never seen another picture like that. And then when he jumps out, before his wings expand, as you can see on the right, he is it's in a partial position of expansion. Now, one of the reasons we went to this place in Alaska was because of the salmon that came running in from the Gulf of Alaska into this river. And here we see a salmon in the middle of a very spectacular event, whereas the salmon are coming in and spawning upstream. The bears come out of nowhere to capture them, and you can see that here. Now we go back to Yellowstone Park, and there's a picture on the left of a trumpeter swan that are very rare, and a beautiful tranquil scene near the entrance of West Yellowstone. And also this this sheep that we also captured during our visit. Another one of my extracurricular activities was fly fishing, and I like to show my buddies here, Michael Coyle, who was a famous lawyer from Bozeman, Montana, Mike Winters, who was a builder and roofer, and my dear friend and lifelong companion in many pursuits, Dr. Francis Zonay, who was an anesthesiologist at the hospital, climbed 3 of the 7 top peaks in the world, taught me everything I know about mountain climbing and dressing for the cold and various techniques. And we skied together, fished together, and mountain climbed and hiked together for many, many years. And here we are together, and here's some of I caught these in 30 minutes in Alaska. These are all salmon. And then here's our trip out into the Pacific Ocean, and here you see us with Dr. Zonay holding a big red fish. Now, one of my other hobbies, pursuits, and lifelong interests were skiing. Now, unfortunately, I didn't learn skiing as a kid. I learned it as an adult, so I'm an adult onset skier. So that means it's very difficult to really get very, very good. However, I worked and worked and worked, and finally, after I stopped doing surgery, I became a ski patrol doctor on the ski patrol at Big Sky, Montana, and skied with them for 6 seasons and really had many wonderful experiences. And here is the mountain that we skied on, and this was to be eventually my undoing. You'll see here on the close side this steep part, and I fell one day on the top of that and was sliding face down, but was able to self-arrest and avoid any injury. But then later, on March 1st, 2011, coming off the peak, I lost a ski, went into the rocks, fractured my rib, and was able to self-arrest, saving a 3,000-foot fall down the mountain to pretty certain life-changing injuries or death. And here you see me in the hospital nursing my broken tibial plateau fracture. I was able to successfully heal that due to the magical orthopedic surgeon, but of course never went back to skiing. So that was what I would call another close call. Now I'd like to switch to the treasured part of our lives, Stella and myself. And here we see from left to right, Carol Ann, our youngest daughter, and her husband David, my middle daughter Lara, of course Stella, myself and Stella, and then here is Nat, who's the husband of my oldest daughter Michelle, and Michelle is holding Miles, and Nat is holding Charlie, and this was in 2008. Now they're both getting ready to graduate. One's getting ready to graduate from high school and thinking about going to college. And here we have the new additions from my youngest daughter, which is Acer, who's 10 months old, and Wesley, who's 7 years old. And these indeed are the treasured parts of our lives. And Miles, Charlie, Wesley, and Acer, 4 wonderful grandchildren. Now I'd like to talk about the next generation. Alfonso J. Tafur, MD. Born in Ecuador, trained, and then his father was a doctor. He came to the United States, trained at the Mayo Clinic, and he also trained under the 2 most famous epidemiologists in our modern history, Dr. John Haidt at the University at the Mayo Clinic, and Dr. Gary Raskob at the University of Oklahoma. And he also could be described as a younger, brighter, more humbler version of myself, like one was depicted. But also he had a photographic memory, and I was unbelievably blessed when he decided to come and work with me at Evanston Hospital. And during that time there, I had a DVT support group for a number of years, and in short, Alfonso took everything I've done to the next level, which is to the absolute joy of a professor. is to have when somebody come in and take the things that you've done and not throw them in the trash, but to make them better. And he did so with his DVT support group and the anticoagulation clinic that I started with Stuart Lind in the 90s. He has taken that to the next level, and now there's a clinic for the new anticoagulants as well. And the Caprini score has finally been introduced and put into everyday practice at Evanston Hospital, and also now it's the Evanston Northwestern Healthcare, which is 6 hospitals. And I don't believe without Alfonso's help that we would have been able to get where we have gotten with this score at the present time. And it's a tribute to his ability to organize things and put them in the proper framework. He's also had a thrombophilia task force and also a pulmonary embolism response team, just legendary accomplishments that are characteristic of his tenure. And now there's 2 other vascular medicine specialists that have come to join him. So my little clinical practice that I was sharing with the hematologist is now dominated by 3 vascular medicine specialists in addition to the hematologist, and they have a very powerful consortium of thrombosis-related activities for the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of blood clots at our now 6 hospitals. And then in addition to that, he's created the PACO Foundation, Patient Awareness for Clinical Outcomes, which he hopes to use to generate increased patient awareness and improve the care of patients around the world. Finally, I'd just like to talk about one of the things that came up by one of my followers, Dr. Giannese from Italy, who took a saying that I had gotten from my dear friend who was a dentist in Montana. And it says, never kill a friend, never treat a stranger. Now, what was meant by that? And of course, Dr. Giannese created a t-shirt, and here you see it. And what it means is that when you meet somebody, you have to interrogate them. You have to get to know them so that you know as much about them as you do about your friend. And of course, you would never treat a stranger without really getting to know them. And of course, you would never kill a friend. So I'd like to thank you all for listening through all of this. And I'd just like to close with a poster that was given to me in my retirement by some of my friends and some of my colleagues, including the wonderful technologists that work with us in the vascular laboratory and all of our medical assistants in the vascular surgery group. So thank you again for listening to all of this, and just remember to fly higher, faster, further into the future. Stay safe, and God bless. Thank you very much for your attention.